Incans were South American Indians that ruled an empire that stretched along the Pacific coast and the Andean highlands from the northern border of present Ecuador to the Mao River in central Chile. The Incan Empire was ruled by one person who was supposedly the descendant of the sun. The living structure of the Incan Empire was divided into 4 quarters with the capital Cusco at the center of the empire. The 4 living quarters of the empire were ruled by 4 nobles that served as the emperor's council. There are many languages in the empire, but the Incans of Cusco, the capital, spoke Quechua, which is now widely spoken by Indians in America. Gender roles in the Incan Empire was heavily recognized, with women wearing long gowns, while men wore loincloths and sleeveless shirts that hung mostly to the knee. If men did not do military work, they would work in the fields. Women would take care of things at home, although women would also help the men in the fields and at farming. Most of the empire's children did not have regular schooling except of the children of nobles. An average house of the empire would look like a one-room structure made out of stone or mud brick. Religion in the Incan Empire contained many deities such as nature and people's ancestors. There is a sacred shrine in Cusco and a temple that is dedicated in the god of creation. A livestock that the Incans used were llamas that had wool for spinning and as transportation when carrying items. Some foods that the Incans ate were stews and stews that contained beans, peppers, tomatoes, peanuts, etc. Maize and potatoes actually originated in ancient Peru, and the meat that was used were from guinea pigs. The Incans developed a very accurate calendar by looking at the movement of the sun. By this, the Incans were able to plan religious feasts to celebrate the harvest. Sacrifices were made in the empire, which would sometimes contain people. The Incans were very good at creating things that would be helping them expand their empire, such as textiles, metalwork, masonry, roads, and etc. The Incans created post houses which contained runners that would carry messages to different places. The Tambo building was roughly built during the 1450s, and the name, which means red tambo, had meaning after the red paint that are still there on the buildings. The Tambo, Colorado, is located in the Pisco province of Peru, typically built near the road system that the Incas built. Its purpose was to serve as an inn for travelers that came to trade, etc., and provided food and lodging for the travelers. Incan buildings were typically built face towards the east, but the Tambo buildings faced the south. The buildings have structures that were split into 3 sections, which one section was for ceremonies, one used for trading, and one for noblemen for meetings. Moray terraces were 15th century Incan created research stations that was used to experiment with microclimates. These terraces were located in northwest of Cusco and are created high up in the hills and extended downwards. The Incans created these terraces that were on different levels to experiment on how altitudes and temperatures relate to each other. The terraces usually stretched from the sea level to the Andean highlands. The terraces were able to help the Incans modify and hybridize crops, which helped them transform foods such as potatoes to create them as more better tasting and healthier.
Inca architecture. So the Incas were known for the most precise and finely shaped stone structures. Their design was uniform, and they often used geometrical and natural forms. An example of this would be the trapezoid windows. The main material that the Incas used to build their architecture was stone, and this was used to create very precise arrangements of blocks to create the finest buildings. The cutting and setting of the blocks was so precise that mortar wasn't necessary. An Incan wall would take several months to build, but their design makes the walls so resistant, and 500 years of earthquakes have left little damage. The Incas had 3 different types of architecture, including civil, military, and religious. An example of civil architecture would be the 12-angled stone, and this was a famous stone from an Incan wall in Peru. This stone has 12 angles, and it shows how precise the Incas were in ensuring that the stone blocks fitted so well together, so they didn't need any mortar. An example of Incan architecture would be Machu Picchu. This is one of the most visited tourist destinations in Peru. It is more than 7,000 feet above sea level, and it's known for its dry stone walls without the use of mortar.
Religion centered around a pantheon of gods, including Inti, a creative god named Varocha, and the rain god named Apu Ilapu. The Incans created many shrines, the most important being the Sun Temple of Cusco. Everyone everywhere worshipped their ancestors, and all mummies were kept, sometimes in their homes, and the emperor's mummies were kept in Cusco. People believed they could communicate with their ancestors in their dreams, and priests were believed to be able to read signs from ancestors. There were many ceremonies celebrating Inti, still performed annually. The Sun Temple of Cusco is one of the most important and sacred temples of the Inca Empire. It sits on top of a large rocky mountain, which is part of the Machu Picchu archaeological site. It is a semicircular shape made up of granite stones with walls plated with 700 gold sheets. Each sheet depicted one of the divine Inca gods.
History of the Incas. They were descendants from the sun god Inti. There were only 13 generations of kings, starting with Manco Capac. In 1438, Pacuti Inca Yupanqui became the leader of the Inca. He started to conquer nearby tribes to expand the control of the Inca Empire. Then he reorganized the government. In 1476, Emperor Tupac defeated the Chuma Empire and their lands to become part of the Inca Empire. In 1493, Hunan Capac, Tupac's son, became the emperor, and the Inca Empire became the largest empire in the world under the reign of Hunan Capac. In 1525, Emperor Hunan Capac died from a plague, the smallpox, that was believed to be brought over by the Spanish conquistadors. A large portion of the Inca population died from that and other diseases over the next several years. Also in 1525, the sons of the Empire Hunan, Al-Hufa and Huascar fight over the crown, which leads to civil war that lasts for 5 years. In 1532, after the 5 years, Atahualpa defeats Huascar and becomes the emperor. In 1572, the Spanish execute the last of the Inca emperors, Tupac Amaru, and the fall of the Incan Empire occurs. For my two pictures, the first one is Cusco. It was the capital of the Inca Empire. The empire was divided into 4 parts, whose corners met at the capital, Cusco. My second picture is the ruler Hunan Capac, the ruler of the Incas from 1493 to 1525, when he died from smallpox.
What was the most abundant resource or resources used for building available to the Incas?
The most abundant resource was the stone they used for their masonry. I think it was a combination of limestone and granite in the Andes Mountains. They tended to have an abundance of that. And, they used some wood for like the trusses, the roofs, and they mainly used thatch instead of shingles. But I think by far their most common building material were limestone and granite.
Okay, second question is, where and what kind of sacrifices did the Incas do in regards to religion?
We have very limited knowledge of the Inca traditional religion because when the Spanish went, can you hear these dogs? I'm so sorry. I'm so conscious about it. When the Spaniards went, they unfortunately did an incredible job of destroying indigenous culture. And as a matter of fact, for a number of generations after Pizarro took over, there's evidence that the Incas made a concerted, but from what we can tell and what we found, they did practice a polytheistic religion. Their temples tended to be built in very different places depending on which god the temple was trying to worship. As far as sacrifices, they would do traditional plant and ceremonial sacrifices, but they did practice some limited forms of human sacrifice. And I think the most recent example that's real high profile is they discovered, it's actually in northwest Argentina, but they discovered some children right below the crest of the top of the volcano in Argentina, like a 14 or 15-year-old girl that's been perfectly preserved, and a 4 and a 5-year-old. And they did like all kind of crazy tests and analyzed their hair and like figured out all the substances they had been feeding those kids. But yeah, it's a little disturbing that they sacrificed children. That's what they did. Fight them with, what they say, they fight them with evidence that they fed them alcohol for a long time and like coca plants, which is pretty much cocaine, and sedated them as well. So anyway, they've been prepared for a while for this sacrifice, which is kind of, anyway.
The third question, how did the Incas' housing structure affect their lifestyle?
Incas lived primarily outdoors. They didn't spend a lot of time indoors. Their housing was simple in the way it looked at it. They were rectangles. They were mainly built out of stone, but they were incredibly durable. They had this form of masonry that they had one form of masonry they built their houses with that had mortar. It was pretty sealed and tight. They had another form of masonry they used to build the carpanon, which is a system of roads and bridges. But the houses were simple, rectangle shaped, square shaped, stone walls. Sometimes they would make it, like especially in the lowlands, out of adobe, which is kind of this baked mud brick type thing, with wooden roof, thatches, no windows. They didn't have glass, of course, but they spent most of their time outdoors. So they just barely they did the basics indoors, but everything else consisted of outdoor living.
Okay. Last question is, how were the religious temples able to connect the Incas to their deities?
How were the religious temples able to connect the Incas to their deities?
Again, not an expert on this. It's my understanding that they worshipped a couple different gods. 2 or 3 of them were higher than others. It was like a water god, Veracosha, I believe it was called. There was a sun god, and they built these temples physically closer to the part of the earth they represented. Like there's a big temple, Lake Titicaca, which is really high altitude. There was, of course, Machu Picchu and others where they were built at 12 and 13,000 feet, and I think they were supposed to be closer to the gods for their worship. So they looked at it as a literal and a physical connection between their deities and them. And they also used the dead as one of those physical and metaphorical connections. Ancestors were visited, kind of like the indigenous traditions of the Dia de Muerte in Mexico was actually begun much sooner. In Inca society, sometimes the dead were brought into temples and positioned in lifelike positions, which sounds super creepy, but that was their connection. They would be brought into the temples, and it would be a literal and a metaphorical connection to their gods.
Okay.
Thank you.